thank you for offering to be interviewed today.
That's okay.
Would you like to say your full name and where you were born?
Warren James Hardy. I was born at Wallsend in Lara Street in 1937. It's almost into Jesmond.
So what do you remember of Hollywood, the Depression camp?
Well, the first time I went up there was most probably about 6, and there were a lot of buildings there. There was a lot of kids went to school, Jesmond School there, and it was pretty basic. It only had one tap from what I remember, and they were mainly made out of galvanised iron canvas and maybe sheets with paper and cardboard on them, and one track going in. And I've got a photo here of the tram line. It was off the tram line at Jesmond. Well, that's a steam tram. That was taken before I was born, but it shows the tram stop in front of where Hollywood was. And you can see a park bench there, and it's just along from Jesmond Park. So the one track from there is still there going up to where Hollywood was. And that's where, of course, the new road's going to go through. But this steam tram, I think it was taken off around about the 1930s, and then they started to electrify it there then. So I'll put that over there.
And is that the current cycleway?
Yes, that's right. It goes from Lambton through to Jesmond there.
So as a kid, you'd walk along the tramway and then cut up to...
Yes. So Hollywood was virtually at the end of Lara Street, and then there's a little street goes down to Gully, and it was over there. And when I was going to high school, the trams had just stopped, and of the morning I'd go for a run from Lara Street through to House Street, up through the cutting there and back again. And that was in between the tram lines, and it was years before they took the steel tram lines up then.
And can you remember who you visited with? Was it with other children in the neighbourhood, or...?
Oh yes, there was, the road behind our place was Chalmers Road, and most of my friends lived in Chalmers Road, with John Hodge and Max Barlow and John Notley and Alan Howell. So we didn't associate so much with the kids in Hollywood. They were like in almost a gang of their own type of thing there.
So how would you describe the Hollywood settlement itself? Like, did you actually visit any of the houses on the
I
side?
didn't go into any, just walking past them, but they were all pretty rough up there, which you'd imagine because the settlement started, as you'd know, in the Great Depression. So people were evicted out of houses, they didn't have jobs, and they were just given around about 5 shillings a week the dole, so they couldn't afford rental properties, so they just went up in the bush there and just put up what they could. So it varied. Some of the houses weren't too bad, but most of them were just shacks, and they, from my memory, most of them went in the 1950s, about in the mid-50s, when they were offered Housing Commission homes, but some just wanted to stop there a bit longer, and eventually they were all evicted out of there then.
Mm. And you mentioned the children who lived there. Were they mainly families, or do you know if there were like couples or single people that lived there?
Mainly families up there from what I remember. I think some of the other Depression camps like Nobbies and that, they might have had more single people in them, but I'm not quite sure about that. But I've got school photos here, and it shows some of the children in the school, if I can find them. And that's one from there, so we'll put that on there.
Yeah.
That's another one, but this one's typical of the time. It was in 1949 in 6th class, and quite a few of the children in this photo come from Hollywood there, and it wasn't just the children in Hollywood, like hardly any of the boys wore shoes to school. And you can see in the front row here, all the children with bare feet along there. So it'd be pretty hard at the time to tell the children from Hollywood as against other children there. Unless you recognised them, you wouldn't know. Like the children were pretty well dressed and clean and everything there. Although they only had one tap, I should imagine they'd take enough water, you know, for cleanliness and everything.
So you were saying, like, even like children that weren't living at Hollywood, it wasn't uncommon for children to go to school without shoes on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know any of the children in the photograph that might have come from Hollywood?
Yes. There's this girl here.
Yeah.
I won't mention the names. But there's this little boy here, and this boy, some of the other girls, this little girl in here, and a few others come from Hollywood there. And this one is taken in 47. And, you know, quite a few of these boys at the back here, like this boy. This was one of my friends, Max Barlow here. And that's the good-looking fella here in the middle. And Kevin Simpson, whose son has got the Simpson shoe shop at Lambton now. This little boy come from Hollywood. John Wright, John Hodge was one of my friends from Chalmers Road. Colleen Taylor, that lived in Alara Street, that little girl come from Hollywood. So there's quite a few of them there. Yeah.
So you mentioned there was only one tap at Hollywood.
Yes.
Were there any other utilities?
No, they most probably had a deep drop toilet out in the bush where they could shift every so often. And some of the more elaborate huts might have had a corrugated roof with a water tank. So they might have had some rainwater, but I couldn't remember that though around there.
And yeah, so just getting back to the children at the school. So what school was this?
This is Jesmond Primary School. It was up on the hill near Lambton. And we had to walk down Blue Gum Road and then up Michael Street to get to there.
Yeah.
And some of the people in Hollywood were gamblers, and one of the chaps used to run the two-up school. And unfortunately, the chap that ran it, he was murdered, and then the body thrown down a mine shaft. He was shot, and it was quite a while before they found the body. And I don't think the murder was ever, who committed the murder was ever found. You know, so it's still a bit of a mystery to me there.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like long after that before they closed the two-up school there. But it used to be on the path from Jesmond up, and I think you can see it on this map. That's Jesmond Park in here. That line there is the tramway. This track is going up to the two-up school. Where that bit of barren ground is, I'm pretty sure that would be the two-up school in there. So there was a tram stop here at Jesmond Park, and people used to walk up the track there and walk back. And you'd see people every afternoon getting off there, and every so often it'd be raided. And the police would surround the place up on the mountains, and then, you know, once they started blowing the whistles, all the two-up players, they'd just scatter, try and get back down to there. And one time, all the boys got up on the hill there with their whistles and blew the whistles, and of course they all started running down there. So now that's on the way, on the cycleway up to the John Hunter Hospital. So there's a creek that goes down through there, And what happens, the cycleway comes up to there, then crosses over the creek and then up a steep hill up to the John Hunter Hospital there.
Yeah.
But this map, it shows a lot. It was aerial photographed in 1938. So it shows exactly where Hollywood extends up there and where in relation to the tramway there. You can also see Jesmond Park. I couldn't remember it, but there was a Chinese garden in there. And I remember down here, I think it's that spot there, there was a sand soap factory. And I think you might even have a photograph of it.
We do,
yes.
actually.
And it's right in the way where the double road is now, the main road going along the Jesmond Strait.
Yeah.
So that's where I was born, at the end of Alara Street in there, in front of the tram stop there.
Yeah. And so that was before there was any shops along
Yes,
the road?
there wasn't a building between Newcastle Road here, right along Blue Gum Road, until you come to Wilkinson Avenue in Birmingham Gardens. So that's where Stockland Mall is now. And the first building to go in was Thomas's Newsagents down here on Blue Gum Road. And on that corner, before they put the double road in, was the Aberdeen Hotel. And there was a grocery shop opposite, so they all had to be removed for the double road there. So the tram line went along there with all these houses in front, and that was called the Crescent along there. This line through here, that was the main railway line in past the coke ovens, which was there in Newcastle Road, under a bridge, and there was a colliery in there, and there was another colliery up further called Elmore Vale. And I've got an idea that Elmore Vale over here, the tunnels went under there. So I don't know how Elmore Vale got its name, but it's named after the colliery. This area in here is the quarry where the brickworks was. That's the ovens in there. So that was Alara Street, Chalmers Road, Victory Parade was up there, and then this was a main track going up through the bush.
That was the brickworks?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So that was a dangerous place for kids, because we used to like to get up in a tree and watch the little skip go up and down. They had a little railway there where they'd fill it up. But every so often they'd set off a big explosion to collapse all the rock down. And of course you'd have whole parts of the top of the cliff face disappearing, trees and everything. So it was, we were warned not to go and sit in the trees around the edge there.
Who went to the Two-Up school?
Oh, mainly people from Newcastle that come out by tram. And I should imagine a lot of people from Hollywood would have got there, because it wasn't far through the bush, you know, from there over to there. And people around Lambton would have been fairly close to it. So, and of course it was pretty isolated up in the bush. And they most probably would have had cockatoos down here to warn the people if the police were coming too.
So what are cockatoos?
Cockatoos are people that get there like they're on the edge, they're the warning people. So they have a look around and see if the police are there, and then they report back. So they're like the spies, you might say.
Yeah.
So it's and then of course this goes on through the cutting up into Lambton. Where the photo of the tram was, that was right down here at the entrance into the track going into Hollywood there.
Yeah. And so as a kid, what did you used to do as for fun?
I roam around the bush mainly. We used to go from here off the end of Chalmers Road around the top of the quarry, and sometimes they'd have a rope down the side, so you'd crawl up and down the side of the quarry, and then these tracks up here, and there was unlimited bush you could get through. You could go right over to Elmore Vale, which was then called South Wallsend. So there was orchards all around there, and where the shopping centre would be just in there, and these were all orchards there. And of course it's a bit like here. As I said before, this was all vacant, and that was cow paddocks down there, and there's some bits of trees, and where the drain come down out beside the park there, come down and under Blue Gum Road there and flow down there. That was concreted, and this went into Ironbark Creek. So there was, where it come underneath the railway, there was a big swimming hole. We used to go swimming in there until it became too polluted. And then one day we went down and the police were there, and they recovered a man's body out of there. So that was the last time we ever swam in there.
Yeah.
But this was all cow paddocks and swamps through here with blackberry bushes.
Yeah.
And of course there was no road from the end of Wilkinson Avenue and Blue Gum Road through past where the university was.
Yeah.
All that bush is where the university is. Yeah. This was called Faulkner's Paddock, where I think initially there was an abattoir, and later on they had motorbike racing up there. And Jesmond School would have been at the top of Michael Street, just off the map here.
Yeah.
So that was called Heaton, which doesn't exist now. And Heaton Bowling Club would have been over in there at the end of Stockland Mall.
Yeah. And do you recall what might have been on the site of where the university is now?
Only trees.
Yeah.
It was all forest through there. And that was the train line that went through from the quarries and everything, the mines out here. And sometimes going to work at the BHP, myself and other people, we'd ride up here and ride along the side of the train line to Maud Street Bridge, and then get off at Maud Street at Waratah and go to all the industries out there. Then it was a bit of a shortcut. Otherwise, we'd have to go over the Lambton Hill, which was a fairly steep hill. So luckily in those days the coal trucks were extremely slow, so you might have been able to hang on to the back of a coal truck and get a tow up the hill.
And so do you recall any structures on the university site?
None whatsoever. Every so often there was big bushfires here, and every year or so there'd be big bushfires going from Wallsend. They'd start over here somewhere, and in those days they were pretty well unstoppable, especially with the westerly wind, and they'd go right through until you got to New Lambton Heights, where the hospital is now. So it'd build up the firewood in there for a few years, and then, you know, be a huge fire go through. But the firemen could only go out with like branches almost to try and put it out. There was no fire hydrants or anything else in there then.
So people living at Hollywood, what do you think they ate? Do they have gardens, or do you know much about how they might have got their food?
Well, I should imagine a few would have had gardens, but it would have been extremely difficult just relying on rainwater, because with one tap they most probably couldn't get that much water, you know, to water them. But I can't remember any gardens there, but it's fairly barren ground up there too. It's on a bit of a rise, so, and on a slope, you know, so the best ground would have been where the Chinese market's down by the beginning of Ironbark Creek in there.
Yeah.
That every so often the Blue Gum Road used to flood too down here, and the water would bank up from Ironbark Creek in there, and that's a photo of Blue Gum Road in the 1955 flood, and you can see it's completely flooded all over that area where Stockland Mall is now, and you can see somebody on a bike, and it's almost up to the handlebars. And then the 55 flood, they brought surf boats out and they rowed people from the beginning of Blue Gum Road right down to Birmingham Gardens, or where it just goes up the hill there into Birmingham Gardens.
Yeah.
So that was pretty devastating, the 55 flood.
Yeah, yeah.
And at the bottom of Blue Gum Road, I believe Blue Gum Road got its name because there must have been blue gum trees along there, and that's a photo of the initial sawmill there, and of course it disappeared way before I was born. That might have existed there 1880s or 1890s, but I should imagine it would have been down in the area down where the creek crosses over somewhere there. And this is another photo of Blue Gum Road. I remember that well. That was taken in 1950, so I would have been 13 then. And you can see Blue Gum Road as a gravel road, and there's nothing whatsoever in that area where Stockland Mall is now. Even on the opposite side of the road, on the eastern side up near Newcastle Road, that's a big expanse. There's no buildings on that either. But it was very rare that a car ever went down Blue Gum Road, so you know, it's a fairly wide one. But it's surprising what you can see on some of these old maps too, because back along the tramway there's a bit of a clearing towards Lambton, and that's where there used to be an army camp during the war. And when they finished the army camp, that's where the Skyline Theatre went in.
Yeah.
And it was more or less a staging post for troops coming up from Sydney heading north. And every so often there'd be a big convoy of trucks taking troops along Newcastle Road and up Blue Gum Road heading north. So it was more or less a stopover area there. And I think it was about 1943, there was a bad accident where a tram ran into one of the trucks on the crossing going into the army camp there.
Yes.
And this line going through here, that's a power transmission line. And of course this track here, coming out of the end of Hollywood, goes up towards Newcastle Hospital here. So this is a later map.
Yeah, 1954.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can see more on the 1938 map there.
Yeah.
This one here, as I mentioned before, the Aberdare Hotel, that was demolished when they had to put the double road in at Jesmond. That's Blue Gum Road in front of it there, and that was a very old hotel. It wasn't in operation when I was born as a hotel, but later on Thomas's newsagents moved into the front, and Harry the barber had the next little room down there where all we went there as kids to have haircuts. And in this building there was a chap called Minto lived. He was in our school too, in there. So I don't know when that was built, but it was called the Aberdare Hotel. So that photo was in 65, so it must have been just before it was demolished there. This photo is taken of my two uncles when they lived at our place. They were more or less almost orphans, so they come to live with us, and that's me, so they were almost like my two older brothers there. So that's Tom and that's Harold. And that's our front fence. It looked like the Sydney Harbour Bridge, a great big arch over there. And of course the tram stop was over there in front of that house where the tram come out of the bush there.
And so that was your mum's brothers?
Yes. Yes,
Yes.
Tom and Harold. And this one was at primary school. That's me and that's Hugo, and that's Alan Howell. And we all must have been getting prizes. I think it was an art prize or something, but it must have been worn because we've all got long socks and shoes and everything on. We're all dressed up for the photo. And it looks as if we've got little ties on as well. And this chap, the headmaster, that's Vic Gilmore, he was an Anzac, the first landing at Gallipoli, and then he went on to be the first headmaster of New Lambton South School. And he used to tell us stories about when they went, and of course they had the training in Egypt before they landed at Gallipoli, and he used to tell us how hot it was. They could just wash and carry their gear around and it was all dry. So half the time he was telling us stories about the war in there, but he was a terrific chap, you know, good headmaster. And these two photos, they're taken just before Newcastle Road was widened, and they are supposed to go together like that, make up a panorama, so if I can get it right. So that was the shop, and just where the photo's taken from, that'll be Aberdare Hotel. So that was a grocery shop, and this is where the tram line went along, just in front of the shop, and then crossed Newcastle Road there and up in front of there, and that's where I was born, in number 2 Alara Street. This was a butcher shop here, and that was Chalmers Road going in the top there, and that car is my first car, Austin A40. And these cars, it must have been a car rally with these old vintage cars there. So this is where the other lane of Newcastle Road goes, straight down through there. So, well, when we went to school, a big thing used to be Empire Day, and we used to go from the school down near the sand soap factory, and there was a Methodist church. And that's where we used to have the plays and everything of a morning, and we'd all have to remember lines, like people would say, I'm from Canada and I do this, and somebody else from somewhere else, and then we'd have the afternoon off, and then at night we'd all build a big bonfire and have cracker night, you know, 24th of May.
Yeah.
So, you know.
And where did you have the cracker night?
Oh, up in a spare paddock in Chalmers Road.
Yeah.
There was plenty of spare room around there.
Yeah.
So we'd build a big bonfire, you know, be building it for about a fortnight, and sometimes other people would come around and sneak in and light it the night before, so, and spoil the whole bonfire, but still that's a risk there.
So who used to go along to that? Was that
all the local kids and the parents, and
yeah.
we'd all save pocket money and you know, get 2 shillings worth of penny bungers and Vesuviuses and Catherine wheels and all that type of thing there.
And can you tell me about the air raid shelter in the neighbourhood?
Yes, the air raid shelter was in the back of next door's block. It was up the back near Chalmers Road on a vacant allotment there, and it was a standard air raid shelter made out of pressed metal, corrugated pressed metal, and it'd be like a dome, like a curve, and it'd be half dug in the ground, and then that soil would be put over the top, and usually in front of the door there was another ramp goes up, a mound, so if there's an explosion outside it wouldn't directly blow in the door. The trouble is digging them in the ground, you know, in a rainy weather they'd fill up with water, but I suppose it was mainly dug by the local residents, but it must have been the Army or the Council put a great big air raid shelter in front of the tram stop in front of our place at Laura Street, and it was huge, and it was mainly in case a tram was there full of passengers, they had to somewhere to go, so they had the big one there.
Yeah.
But it was pretty damp and, you know, dug into the ground too.
Yeah.
But I think they got rid of that in around about 1946 or 47. It didn't last long there, but it was very dark inside too, as you'd imagine.
So the one that was in the block next door towards Chalmers Road, was that ever used? Like, were
No,
there any?
none of them were used. No. There used to be a warden come around, you'd have to put blankets up at the window, and if there was a little bit of light coming out, the warden would go and advise the people to pull the blanket along a bit further. But the trouble is the BHP was still in operation, and when they dumped the slag, it'd light up all under the clouds. It must have been brilliant from the air, and I'd say if there was Japanese bombers, they would have seen the glow by the time they got south of Brisbane.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have looked chinks in the people's curtains. But there was a searchlight on the top of Lambton Hill. There was a couple of searchlights around, but no, the air raid shelters were never used, but after the war, it was good for kids to play in anyway.
And so your helmet and gas mask, that was sort of provided to you as a child and just kept
Well,
in
yes, and they were kept in the air raid shelter.
Yeah.
So it was fully fitted out with maps and first aid gear and helmets and everything, so it was pretty well prepared then.
Yeah.
And one of the advices to people back then was to have a rifle in the house. So, if there was a parachute, soldiers coming in, then, everybody would be a bit prepared. So, one time too, I think in the First World War, they were short of rifles, so they, had to collect people's rifles then.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to say about like your parents or their role in the community, or was it at a time during the Great Depression where people were just basically sort of just trying to survive?
Well, I think everybody was just trying to survive. Like my dad was out of employment for quite a while, and what they'd do of a morning, like hardly any of them had cars, they'd get on the push bikes and they'd go over the Commonwealth Steel, or what the previous Commonwealth Steel was, New Bowls next year that used to make fire bricks, and then to the BHP and Rylands, and they'd come out the front of the morning and say, I'll have you, you and you, and there might have been 200 people waiting there. And I suppose Dad was lucky in a way. He must have had a little bit put away because he could build the house of an afternoon, so at least he had something to do. But a lot of people weren't that fortunate, and they could just pick up work where they could. And I think, I wouldn't be sure about this, but if you had savings in the bank, you could only draw it out at 5 shillings a week. But I'm not sure, how much there, but during the Depression from about 1930 on until about tapered off after about 35, but it was still rough, by the time people were in Hollywood. Like people living in Hollywood right through the 40s and into the 50s. So the Depression was pretty well over, by then. It started, as I said, about the 1930s or so. But Dad was lucky, he was pretty skillful. He could build the house himself, as a lot of people could. They'd just go, and some people even just built half a house or, garage, and just stopped in the garage there. And things were pretty basic. A lot of the houses only had one power point, and if you were lucky, they'd have a radio, a plug-in radio, and most of the time people just had an ice chest. with the Iceman coming around once a week. And it wasn't until pretty well 1948, 1950s, people started to get refrigerators like an Electrolux, and some of the refrigerators were gas operated. Mainly today they're all electric, but some of them were gas. And for heating, sometimes they just had a kerosene heater, which was pretty dangerous, because if something tipped it over, you know, the whole lot would go up, burn the house down then.
Yeah. And did you have a bathroom in the house, or was that out the back?
Oh, we had a bathroom in the house, so I used to bath in the tub sometimes.
Yes. So was the toilet out the back as well?
Yes, the toilet was out the back, and we were lucky we were connected up to the sewer system.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people weren't, so they still had the dunny man come around and collect the pans. But we were pretty lucky that way, you know, and pretty lucky we had a fairly big block of land where Dad could grow vegetables, and I used to grow passion fruit, and that's how I used to make a lot of money. I had passion fruit growing all around the back fences, and I'd fill an army haversack up with them, and I'd go pedal over to Wallsend, sell them to the fruiter there for a penny each. Yeah. So it was a good way. And another way was to collect manure and sell bags of manure. They come out of the big paddock where Stockland Mall was. And another way was to pick blackberries and sell them by the cupful in around Hamilton. Yeah. So there was a lot of little ways of making pocket money then.
And what about shooting rabbits for meat?
Well, I never did. People used to go trapping rabbits and along Minmai Road, because there was old mine workings and there was plenty of blackberry bushes out there, so there was a lot of rabbits around, you know, and I had one, but it was a pretty distasteful type of habit.
When did they have the first picture theatre around?
Oh, well, we used to travel to Wallsend in Nelson Street, and there was Phelan's Picture Theatre. It was a pretty old-fashioned thing. It had no curtain in front of the screen. It had bush poles holding the galvanised iron roof up, and ventilation and light. They had just flaps that were put out and just pushed out by a bit of wood in there. And the other more upmarket one was Jones's. It was down near where the stormwater channel goes under there. And it'd technically, I suppose, be into Plattsburgh. But we'd be given a shilling. It was a penny either way in the tram and sixpence to go into the picture theatre, and the rest you could buy some scallops or chips or something like that there. Yeah. And that one, well, I think they went out of business back in about 1950s or something. They didn't last long down there. Yeah. But a big suburb out there was called Plattsburgh. It was most probably bigger than Wallsend, but I don't think it's recognised now. On the trams, they used to have Wallsend Plattsburgh on the front, but now I suppose they just have Wallsend there. And my dad was born at a place called Brookstown, and it was at the end of Plattsburgh, almost along where Wallsend Hospital is. In that area, they used to call it Brookstown, near the White Gates. And the White Gates was where the road goes over the old tram and train line going into Wallsend. There was part of the train line, it had to cross over the tram line. They kind of come at a very acute angle to one another. And after the tram line and the train line's finished, there was up at one of the little bridges, the road bridge over the train line, there was a little trolley with 4 wheels on. We used to drag it out, put it on there and roll it right down through where the White Gates is. You know, it was a bit of fun. To make it stop, we had a bit of rope and a little bit of tram line with the holes punched through and tie the rope through there like an anchor and throw it off the back, you know, so a lot of things. And same with the dip from what was called the Co-op coal mine at Wallsend. It's on the side of Wallsend High School. And in the high school grounds was where they had coke ovens too. So there was a big train line went down over a bridge over, I think it's still Ironbark Creek, that comes out of Nelson Street and down and joins up with the creek that comes out of Jesmond there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And so your dad's name was Jim Hardy.
Mm-hmm.
What did his father
James
do?
George Kent Hardy. Yeah.
What was his father's name, and was he...
That was John Hardy, and he'd come from Durham in England, and he was a bricklayer.
Yeah.
So he most probably just worked around mines and railway lines, you know, doing the brickwork and everything there. Yeah.
And also I'll talk about like Young Wallsend.
Yes.
What was that?
It was right out on the road. Oh, it would be where Edgeworth is now, Young Wallsend.
Yeah.
So there's a little shopping centre there with a hotel on the corner, and that was Young Wallsend. Of course, West Wallsend still got its name there, and Wallsend, of course, come from Wallsend in England, outside of Newcastle on Tyne.
Yeah.
And my grandmother, she came out from Ireland when she was 18, and I still don't know, you know, what went on. Maybe the times were so hard in Ireland, and I think for a period they were paying young ladies £10 to come to Australia because there was such an imbalance between the male and the female populations here. So she came out like a lot of other Irish girls come out, but it must have been a rough old time on a sailing ship, especially if you got seasick or anything there.
Exactly. So with your dad, when he was born about 1900?
1900, yes.
And so did he get into coal mining in his teens? Or
Yes,
did he do
I think he was most probably about 14, and Uncle Ted Devon, their family owned a coal mine, if you could call it a coal mine. It was pretty well on the junction of Minmai Road and the road that goes into the present garbage dump, the tip out at Wallsend. And it was very shallow mining, and there was all susceptible to a lot of cave-ins there. And Dad used to go and look after some of the pit horses. I don't think he ever went down the mine that much, you know, but he used to just do the rouseabout jobs, looking after pit horses and things like that, and had a dog there. And there was a story about some of the miners went down one morning, and they could see these two red lights at the end of the shaft. And then all of a sudden the red lights were coming towards them. They didn't know what it was. They probably thought it was the devil or something. And when they ran out, after them run out a cow, because it must have been a cave-in, and the cow had fallen in and been standing in the dark, and as soon as it seen the lights, of course it come towards them there, you know, so. But a lot of those mines would have just collapsed, and it was like in the Jesmond bush. You could go along, and same in Blackbutt, there's whole rows, ditches, where the whole mines eventually collapsed down. Yeah. And in the Jesmond bush too, there was a lot of air shafts. Like the mines had to get ventilation, so these were just very deep holes. Yeah. And of course that's where they found the body of the chap that ran the two-up school eventually down there.
Yeah. And do you want to say anything about where your dad worked later at the Cardiff Railway Workshops?
Yes, he went out to, he worked at the Rylands near the BHP for quite a long time, and then just before he retired, he worked out at Cardiff on steam trains, and that's a photo of my dad out the back there. So he was, yeah. So that's an old steam train behind him there, and that's where he worked for a long time.
Do you know any of the other people in the
No, I don't know any of them there.
No.
Yeah.
And that would be out at Cardiff?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
at Cardiff there. Yeah, at that stage he didn't ride a bike to work. All the time he was at Rylands, you know, the same as me riding a bike to the BHP every morning, as nearly everybody else did. BHP didn't have any car park at all. They had a lot of private buses, like from Wallsend it was Lindsay's bus, and they had buses coming in from Merriweather, and I suppose half the people rode bikes and the other half went by buses.
Well, do you want to tell us about Tomahawk Joe?
Tomahawk Joe, he was an American, 6'8", huge chap with a beard, a very wild looking fellow. He said he was an American Indian, but I doubt if he was Indian. He come out to Australia and he was a showman that went all around Australia, and he had a partner. I've got an idea a name might have been Lil, but might not have been too. But he used to throw tomahawks with his partner up against a wooden board at the show and circuses like that. There'd be a tomahawk either side of her ears and underneath the arms, etc. And she died fairly early. I don't know if it was from a tomahawk attack or not, but I doubt if it was. When he retired, he used to live in a house at the top of Michael Street, just down from Jesmond School. It was almost next to a grocery shop there, and he didn't do any work on the house, no maintenance. It was vastly overgrown, and he used to also specialise in keeping snakes, but they used to get wild and get in the undergrowth around the house. And from what I remember, he got wilder as he got older, and as kids would come down from a primary school and yell out "Tomahawk Joe" in front of the house and then take off, and he'd come to the door waving his hands, and we were dead scared of him. You know, he had such a bad reputation, but he virtually ended up a hermit in the house there. And I don't know what happened to him, whether he passed away in the house or not, but that would have been back in the late 40s, 1940s there. But all the kids were dead scared of him, and I suppose his reputation got worse as the years went on. But as I remember him, he was an extremely wild-looking fellow, and you know, as soon as we yelled out, we'd just have to take off down the street.
That's big. Tell us about the gypsies in the neighbourhood.
Well, what happened, the gypsies used to only come in for about 2 days. I don't know where they camped, but I suspect they'd camp up in the bush near Hollywood somewhere, because they'd come in their gypsy wagons and they'd come around from house to house, and one of the good tricks was they'd ask to bless people's money, or if they didn't, to put some kind of curse on them or something like that. And usually as people were at the front door getting their couple of coins blessed, somebody would be in the back door going through the tea canister. That's where people used to hide their money, in the tea canisters. But they could only last in an area for about 2 or 3 days, because otherwise they'd be hunted out. So they'd have to go to get fresh victims all the time. But gypsies weren't very welcome. Private cars going there then. And there was a fellow lived up further Newcastle Road called Dick Penman, and he was a pretty good bike rider. And as kids, us apprentices working at the BHP, used to try and race him. We never could beat him though, because before I think he'd been a professional bike rider, so he was too good for us. But sometimes we go in races from the Racecourse Hotel at Wallsend to a bridge just out of Minmai over all the hills there. It was a bit of fun. But the Devons, my uncle Ted Devon, his parents, they used to live at Wallsend, and I think they lived in a 2-storey house, still had earth floor, and they used to manage the racecourse at Wallsend near the Racecourse Hotel there. Yeah. And I used to go along the bike along Minmai Road, and that's where I'd pick a lot of the blackberries, just past the halfway house on the way to Minmai there. Yeah. So, yeah, there was a lot of little family mines, and they would have been everywhere in Blackbutt Reserve and Merriweather. People would get in and just a family would start to dig a little mine, might have only lasted a few years. And then Ted Devon, he bought hotels at Muswellbrook and Gunnedah, and I went to Gunnedah for about, what would it be, 3 months, and that would have been about 1943, I think. And that was during the war, and then come back to Newcastle there. And then Ted Devon, he went down to the Hawkesbury, retired, and he used to go fishing every day with the water policemen down there, and they had a crash boat. That was a boat they used to use during the war to go and pick airmen up out at sea. It had 2 big diesel engines in it. It was most probably the size of a torpedo boat, and they'd go from Brooklyn up to Spencer to catch fish, but the fish they caught was only bait for where they went out to the heads and caught kingfish. Yeah. And I'd have the thrill of my life. I'd only be a little kid, and they'd let me drive the boat from the railway bridge up towards where the road bridge was. Yeah. I think the road bridge opened around about 1949 or something like that there. Yeah.
Very young, where did your parents seek medical help if there was any emergencies?
Oh, there was a local doctor at Wallsend, and you could go there, or the doctors used to have house calls then. So, you know, if you were sick in bed with a bad flu, the doctor would come to the house. Something they hardly ever do now, but it was quite common then. Yeah. You know, we'd have the circuit, you know, and he'd come around to all the houses then there. Yeah, and of course they had the Daisley, the dentist, was in Nelson Street, and it was an old belt-driven drill, and we'd all have to go up there as kids, and unfortunately I was about the 3rd one to go in. I was still in the waiting room, and I could hear John Hodge screaming in there. It's a wonder I didn't run out. You know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what about Wallsend Hospital? That was well established?
Yes, that was from community donations mainly, and from miners and things like that. So that was all established there. And there was a first hospital, and then later on, you know, the other one was built. Yeah. But there was a hospital there from very early days. I don't know what date, you know. Yeah.
And were there midwives and nurseries where women went to have babies?
Well, the doctor came to the house when I was born. I think a lot of other people were born in houses then, you know, not so much in hospitals there.
So you were born in Alara Street?
2 Alara Street. Yeah. There.
Well, Warren, thank you very much
for that's my pleasure.
Offering the interview today.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. Yeah.